Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fairbank Center series on critical issues for contemporary China. I'm Bill Overholt from Harvard's Kennedy School. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Anne-Marie Brady, who is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and also a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. We're particularly grateful to her because it's 5:30 in the morning in New Zealand, where she is. She's an expert on Chinese foreign and domestic policies and on the geopolitics of the Arctic, the Antarctic, and Oceania. Professor Brady is the author of 5 books and has also edited numerous books. Her most recent books provide path-breaking research on China's aspirations to be a polar power, and an edited collection on how smaller Western democracies are coping with their geopolitical challenges. She's going to talk to us today about the role of the United Front in China's foreign policies. Professor Brady, over to you.
I will just jump in real quick before we start, just so people know how to do questions, because I'm sure there will be plenty. There's a Q&A tab in the bottom of your screen. Please just click on that. If you want to ask a question, you can ask the question anonymously. But if you choose not to do so, please let us know who you are and your institution. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, warm Pacific greetings. Thank you very much for hosting me today, and it's my great pleasure to share with you my research and thinking on how democracies and other states can address China's political interference activities. So I'm going to use a sort of framing that we often have on social media today: how it started, what's happening now. So that's the title of my talk: how it started, what's happening now, magic weapons. So I want to start with the how it started. I'm a specialist on Chinese domestic and foreign policy, as well as polar politics and New Zealand foreign policy, as it was said. And in 2017, I was invited to be part of an edited book project looking at China's political interference activity. And as was the gentleman on my right, John Garno, who was formerly a journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald and became an advisor for the Turnbull government in Australia. And he'd been involved in a big project for a couple of years, which was for the Australian government, whereas I'd been working on my research, which had a lot of overlaps, and we'd had many contacts over the years on how the CCP works and the policies of the CCP. So I was asked to look at a case study on New Zealand, on China's political interference in New Zealand. And John was giving the example for the group about Australia's political interference, because China's political interference in Australia, the overall theme of our group project was China's political interference activities around the world. But when I started to do my research, I found a lot more than our editor may have thought that I was going to find. And I actually got to the point of thinking that I couldn't wait for academic publishing, which literally took 3 years for that book to come out, and that I needed to go public with my research, because I found some very concerning pieces of information. For example, the impact of considerable donations coming to our political parties from CCP connected individuals, an MP, member of parliament, who disguised his working for Chinese military intelligence for 15 years before he'd come to New Zealand and so on. And John also had a big body of information which didn't go public initially. So we both came to this conference workshop in Arlington with these bombshell revelations, and both of us, and we discussed it with our fellow participants. It was a closed workshop, and both of us separately had our meetings in Washington, DC, as in his case, well organized, because he was coming with the awareness of the Australian government. In my case, I'm a scholar, and I have many long-standing associations in Australia, in Washington, DC. And so it was like two rockets going into the US administration, New Zealand and Australia, with really severe cases of China's political interference. And it really fed into the zeitgeist. It sort of crystallized thinking in the US administration. And my research went public the 2 days after the conference, and the work that John had done was already being shared in Australia and had already been started to talk about. We now have a global conversation on this topic, and we weren't the only ones. Of course, there are others who were at our workshop who were working on it, but our work was like a spark plug that helped to engender a much more focused conversation about the issue and what to do. And this connection's actually been was acknowledged in January this year by one of the former senior officials of the previous administration. So that's how it started. And I'm now going to talk about the changes and the developments behind Chinese foreign policy that led up to what we're talking about, and what kind of remedies different governments have had. So China and the world, according to CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping, is in a new era. China is now aspiring to be a global great power, and in many ways meets the measures of how we assess a great power, and is seeking change in the global order. And Xi Jinping's policies are building on long-standing thinking within the CCP, but also 2 decades of double-digit growth. Xi Jinping's administration is able to take action on ambitions that have been there long-standing. And the concept of rich countries, strong military, Fuqiang is the shorthand version of it, is one of the ways in which that thinking is symbolized, that China will have a strong military and be rich and prosperous. That's a synonym for the status that China seeks. And in global terms, that's China is a great power. So what I have identified in my research is the 3 prongs of China's contemporary foreign policy. State to state, we're familiar with that, relations between governments and officials. And we're increasingly seeing military shows of force in the South China Sea, but also beyond the South China Sea down into the South Pacific, for example, into the Arctic. And the 3rd prong are covert activities, and these include United Front work. And United Front work has, in CCP history, been used for intelligence, but it's also been used as a way to bring together non-party members to get acceptance and acquiescence for CCP rule, and also to influence and shape key elites. And people have traditionally thought of United Front work as something that was only focused on China's domestic needs, or it was only targeted at Chinese people. But there is something called international United Front work, and it's always been a CCP policy. It was very prominent in the 1930s and 40s. And that's what we're seeing internationally today, is China's international front work playing out in different countries. That's how the party calls it. How countries like New Zealand and Australia and the US would call it as political interference activities, and milder versions of it, or less cooperative or coercive or corrupting, might be called political influence activities. And Xi Jinping calls United Front work a magic weapon. And he's taking his terminology from Mao Zedong, who said that the three magic weapons of the Chinese Revolution were armed struggle, in other words, the role of the PLA, party discipline, and united front work. It was the united front work that, for example, led to the surrender of Beiping, the what is now Beijing, from internal members of the party who were within the administration there. So United Front work has had a really important role for the CCP, but it's really been emphasised under Xi Jinping and re-resourced. And as I've shown in my research, contemporary United Front work combines a nexus of party, state, military and market entities. And I showed this in my paper, Magic Weapons, which is there in the Wilson Center if you want to read it. You can see how large Chinese companies, whether private or state-owned, can be involved in CCP United Front work, for example, being the source of donations into political parties. And there's an intertwining of interests. United Front work, or United Front, is a Leninist concept. Lenin talked about in one of his famous articles, criticizing his fellow communist members for not being willing to form alliances where necessary, temporary alliances for a long-term goal. It's an article called on leftist infantilism. And the CCP has made this concept their own. So every United Front has a chief enemy. And in World War II, the chief enemy in China's United Front was Japan. But in the present day, the main target, the chief enemy of the CCP's United Front work is the United States. Hence the focus on allies and partners of the US, such as New Zealand or Australia or the UK. And there's been a lot of attention on that. But one of the things that I highlighted when I first presented my research in Washington, DC back in 2017 is that the US is the main target, and the US is also experiencing a lot of United Front work activities, and more on that in a minute. So there are both domestic pressures and a foreign policy agenda that comes behind the CCP's enhanced, expanded United Front work. CCP under Xi Jinping is ruling China in crisis mode and trying to impose its will over Chinese society, rolling out policies that were followed, draconian policies that were followed in Xinjiang and Tibetan areas more broadly across the whole of China. And we're seeing United Front work prominent in domestic Chinese politics, as well as internationally. China feels itself subject to what the party would call hostile foreign forces. It's aware that it has negative international public opinion, and so it needs to step up its efforts to try and change that. And so I've looked at case studies in the last few years, many different case studies looking at China's political interference activities. I've looked at New Zealand in detail, but I also then used the template that I created in the Magic Weapons paper to look at Albania. I've looked at many different Pacific Island states. I've looked at Iceland, Japan, and through the work of my graduate students, I've been looking at Vietnam and Pakistan. And so what I've found is that we can find many of the different approaches of CCP United Front Work that I identified in my Magic Weapons paper template, but they vary according to the society. For example, whether a society has a large overseas Chinese diaspora that may become an important vector in a country like New Zealand that has a significant overseas Chinese population, in a country like Albania, it's not a priority. Other aspects such as elite capture become more important. But the CCP, like Russia, will find the cracks in our society. And I use the analogy of water on limestone. Every block of limestone will have cracks. We can't necessarily perceive them with our own eyes, but Russia and China are looking for the cracks in our society and looking to exploit them. So I want to go and do a little bit of a tangent now and give a bit of a backdrop to the changing geopolitics and from China's point of view and thinking that has led up to some aspects, important aspects of United Front Work as I've identified it in the Magic Weapons paper. So I first want to talk to you about the politics of maps. You will be, being in the northern hemisphere, will be used to seeing the world through the lens of the map on the left here, an Atlantic-centered ocean. And the rest of the world, like the part of the world that I live in here in New Zealand, and the states of the South Pacific and the Southern Hemisphere, are used to seeing a Pacific-centered map. But maps are cultural and historical and political, and they're also not even necessarily geographically accurate. The sizing of states has to be fitted in to the dimensions of the map. So we're getting we're getting a very particular view of the world decided by these historical political visions of our world. Here's another vision of the world, representing the new geopolitics. And this is an official map of China. It was created by a very ambitious and original geographer who I went to interview in Wuhan. And it's influenced by the thinking of the founder of modern geopolitics, Harold Mackinder, who talked about the world island. And in this vision of the world, it's a China-centered order. And you can see how the countries of the world are mostly connected by land. You see how Antarctica is prominent in this map, like a white peacock. You can see the Arctic is like is in a middle ocean. In Chinese, the word for Mediterranean is a middle ocean that is connecting North Asia to North America. And you see overall the prominence of China. China is a heartland. So this map is used by is now used by the PLA and has been so for about 15 years. It was issued, it's used for their missile timing and positioning, for their positioning. And it was issued as an official map of China in 2014, part of a package of maps by the Hunan publishing company. And the map that it was a pair with got a lot of attention. It was the first ever official map of China with the 9-dash line. But this map is much more significant politically. So China's new geopolitical thinking, which really highlights maritime policy, and Xi Jinping has very much emphasized this since he has come to power, you might be surprised to know, is influenced by yet another foreigner, this time not a German or a Russian one, but an American, Alfred Mahn. So Alfred Mahn was a naval historian, and he was writing for the US government, trying to work out how, looking at the rivalry between the Great Britain and France, and how the rising powers had who had been able to succeed, and how they've been able to dominate. And these were the categories that he highlighted as being important for a rising power. A rising power had to develop a blue water navy to be able to protect their sea lines of communication. And China had not originally had a blue water navy. The People's Liberation Army Navy was set up on the advice of the Soviet Union, and it was designed to protect China's coastal waters. And there's been a revision of that thinking, a turning against Soviet thinking on naval forces since the early 1980s, when the then Chinese Minister of Defense issued new thinking. And back in the 1980s, China had limited ability to develop that thinking. And as I said, that double-digit growth has really helped to forward that vision. And we now see China with a very significant blue water navy. And the next piece of advice that Mahn offered was that rising power had to have access to be involved in global markets and have privileged access to resources in order to help to stimulate economic growth and be a dominant power. It can be through colonies, or it can be through market access. And China is indeed now a global economic power which is seeking privileged access to strategic resources. And the final point that Mahn makes is the need to develop maritime consciousness in the population. Historically, China, whether in dynastic times, whether in the time of the Republic of China, or since 1949, has not had strong maritime consciousness in the population. So educating the population and making them aware and interested in the maritime domain is another priority, according to Alfred Mahn. So here's another influence on this geopolitical thinking, Harold Mackinder. Harold Mackinder wrote a famous book after World War I, where he was trying, like many, to understand why had Europe gone to war so many times. And here you see his map, which was extremely original in his time, connecting the world, this connected world island, which the map I showed you, the vertical map, is inspired by. And Harold Mackinder famously spoke about the heartland. He who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. So Mackinder talked of Europe as the heartland, but in this map here, you can see China as clearly as the heartland of this map. And of course, the traditional and current word for China is the Middle Kingdom. There's another foreign influence on China's maritime thinking, and again, it's Americans, Dean Acheson and John Foster Dulles. Acheson's the concept that Acheson, then Secretary of State, promoted of the island chains. And here you see a map showing the first, second, and third island chain, the third goes from the Aleutians down Hawaii, all the way down to New Zealand, down to Antarctica. And that maps actually the dimensions of the Indo-Pacific command to this present day. So the island chains concept is still very important. And the series of hub and spoke defense pacts that the United States set up in the 1950s, starting with the peace treaty with Japan, and then the ANZUS treaty, treaties with Korea and the Republic of China. and in the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And John Foster Dulles had another concept that's influenced China a lot, and that's the concept of peaceful evolution, the idea that more and more, that the US and other states should engage more and more with the Eastern Bloc, particularly culturally and socially and economically. And the more that it does so, it will erode communism and gradually lead to a peaceful evolution. So from the CCP's point of view, that's containment, and that's an example of hostile foreign forces trying to break up China. So you can see from what I'm trying to share with you here, some aspects of why United Front work would be important to the CCP. It's in part defensive, and it has been for a long time, but I would say that it's gone on the offensive under Xi Jinping. So there's one more factor I want to draw your attention to in the CCP's evolving maritime doctrine and the connection it has to CCP political interference. And that's a deep fear of choke points. So famously, 80% of China's trade goes through the Malacca Strait. And so there is China's geopolitical thinking in part is part of trying to look at alternatives from that choke point. So these are the 4 points that I highlighted in my Magic Weapons paper, which began with a template of CCP political interference activity based on what I found CCP policies, documents of agendas aiming and strategies to influence foreign publics and engage in activities that would connect to enhance CCP interests and policies. So the first category is, and here I don't put them in order because they, as I said before, they differ in how significant they are for each country, and each country has a different setup. Each country has a different set of block of limestone. But for my country, New Zealand, and any country that has a significant overseas Chinese diaspora, a very prominent vector of CCP political interference efforts to target and to manage that Chinese diaspora, to manage their community groups, to bring their media under control, and in some cases to utilize or attempt to utilize people within the ethnic Chinese community as agents, whether witting or not, of Chinese foreign policy. So that's very difficult for our Chinese diasporas, as I've identified in my research. For example, using New Zealand as the case study, our Chinese population they're not all from mainland China. About just over 50% are recent migrants from mainland China, but those who were voted with their feet. We have people who historically, for Chinese from have come from Malaysia or Vietnam or Hong Kong and Taiwan. They don't relate to the CCP, but the CCP views the overseas Chinese community as potentially a threat for CCP rule. Historically, Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China, spent most of his adult life living outside China and supported by the overseas Chinese diaspora until the Chinese Revolution came. And the CCP would greatly fear any future Sun Yat-sens being nurtured by the overseas Chinese diaspora. And the overseas Chinese media could potentially be a great critical voice against the policies of the Chinese mainland. So the CCP has really prioritized neutralizing the overseas Chinese diaspora, particularly since 1989 with the student protest movement, where there was a degree of support of people within the Chinese diaspora for the student protests in China. but it's got a lot more than that under Xi Jinping. And the outcome, as I've shown in my research, is that for some diaspora communities outside China, there's been a real impact on freedom of association, on feelings of safety. People don't feel safe because of CCP activity within their communities, and their media media controls, CCP internal media controls have been merged over the overseas Chinese media, so that reading a newspaper in Chinese, if you are in outside China, could be very different editorial, little editorial line from something that you would read in the Chinese mainland. So the second category that I identified was efforts to target foreign elites, particularly foreign political elites, but also the business elites. And there's been a real stepping up of the role, not only of the United Front Work Department, but the International Liaison Department, which is the foreign policy arm of the CCP, trying to engage in diplomatic links via party-to-party links, and not just with fellow communist parties, but more broadly. The party is back, as they say. The CCP is blurring the lines between party and state, and using these party links as a tool of United Front Work. And I should emphasize that United Front Work is not just the task of the CCP United Front Work Department. It's a task of all party members and all party entities. And that's why you'll find many different CCP entities engaging in it. And famously, Friends of China have been involved in China's, or incorporated in China's United Front Work. And we're seeing more and more how prominent politicians have been targeted, offered advantages. They themselves may be, usually it's retired politicians, they may be doing business in China, have their own reasons for wanting to work closely with the CCP, but the CCP is trying to use them as a channel to shape the politics of their countries. And the CCP targets, United Front Work targets local government too, because central government agencies might has the advantage of good advice on foreign policy risk, strategic risk, but local government doesn't necessarily have that level of access. So I noticed last year your former Secretary of State giving an address to US governors, trying to alert them to this challenge, and how there had been efforts to influence and shape US governors. And in many countries, we see targeting of city governments and other local level governments to try and influence and shape their policies, and to set up initiatives such as the Belt and Road project, which I'll talk about in a minute, which the central government might not agree to. Universities have been another vector of CCP United Front Work. I know a big conversation in the United States in the last couple of years has been about civil military transfer of technology to China, and how it breaches both our government's international obligations under the Wassenaar arrangement, but also has great strategic risk. And again, universities are encouraged to seek external funding and to engage in research exchanges. And the CCP has encouraged the more and more scientific links and connections with foreign universities in order to access technology that it's not able to directly get itself through purchasing it, or it can't produce itself. And universities have also been a vector to press governments to not to react to China's political interference activities. Universities and academics have an important role in our democratic society as a voice on government policy. So that's another reason why their interest to CCP political interference. The third vector is China's multi-platform global communication strategy. Under Xi Jinping, the narrative is tell a good story of China. China feels itself working in a hostile information environment. It's trying to shape global perceptions about China. We've seen the impact on film, for example, and this didn't start under Xi Jinping. There has not been a China critical movie made in Hollywood since 1997, since the two films were made that China objected to very strongly, Kunlun and 7 Years in Tibet. And China is a big market for Hollywood. Hollywood wanted to get into China, and they were restricted in accessing the China market until relatively recently. The Hollywood films were in China, but they were pirated. And so Hollywood has cooperated with CCP censorship requirements in order to access the massive China market. But we're all now experiencing that CCP censorship in film and also in some television production, in publishing, where there's a lot of international publishing. The books are printed in China, and that means that they have to follow the same censorship guidelines as required for any other publishing in China. We've also seen the impact on academic publishing. There's been very good research done which documented how some of the biggest publishing companies in the world, such as Cambridge and Springer, were removing any sensitive publications from their package of journals that they were then on selling to China. So, and this risks a silencing effect on academia beyond that what is sent into China. And then there's the impact on the media. So in the Mao era, there were very few foreign journalists in China, other than the Soviet TASS correspondent. But from the 1980s, the number of foreign journalists gradually grew. And there were, but now we've seen in the last couple of years a steady reduction in the number of foreign journalists in China. China does not want foreign eyes on the political situation in China. It views the Western media as hostile. It also believes that many Western journalists are akin to spies, and some of them literally spies. And so we've seen many Western journalists forced out of China in recent years, and there's now only a handful of Western journalists remaining in China. So that has an impact on the rest of us as well as suiting the controls that China wants. So the final vector is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And you can see from what I was saying before about the fear of choke points and the desire to strengthen China's control of its sea lanes of communication, and then the expansion into a blue water navy, that thinking of Man and its impact on China's Belt and Road Initiative policies. The Belt and Road, it built on policies that developed in the Jiang Zemin era, the going out strategy, but it's much more ambitious than that. Apparently, the Central Propaganda Department has issued instructions that there should be no proper map showing all the links and connections, none issued publicly, of the Belt and Road Initiative. It would blow your mind if you could see all the dimensions of it. This map shows some of the broad focus points, but even this, which is more information than most because it talks about the Pacific connection, it doesn't show, for example, the emphasis on the Arctic as well. Now, multiple land and sea route connections, plans for ports and airports. And then there's the digital Silk Road. China, like Russia, is developing its own global navigation system. GPS is both a military technology and a civil technology, and it was the Taiwan crisis in 1995 that where there was missiles fired across the Taiwan Strait, that the PLA realized that GPS was not a good technology for China to rely on. They needed their own independent, similar technology. But it's not as easy for China or Russia to roll out a global navigation system. They don't have the allies and friendly partners on the scale that the United States does around the world, and they're starting from scratch. But partners in the Belt and Road Initiative are supposed to join the Digital Silk Road, to agree to Beidou ground stations, to take Beidou navigation systems and as a part of navigation systems within their country, to take up Huawei technology and other Chinese telecom, which will use Beidou in their systems. And then they will provide micro positioning information to China's navigation system. So there are strong military imperatives to the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as being part of a much more ambitious global vision, as I talked about earlier, the new era. So China's political interference activities has had a significant impact on many countries like my own. But when I first presented my research in 2017, there was a strong defeatist narrative. Many in my country, as in other countries, believe there was nothing we could do. We have China's our most important market, and that's the same for many, many countries in the world, that China is their most important market. And so in my research, one of the things I've tried to do is to emphasize that we do have our own magic weapons, and we do have many strategies that we can adopt to make ourselves more resilient and to address this challenge. And I note that in Kennan's long telegram, which had a big influence on thinking on how the US was to respond to the Soviet Union, resilience was something that he emphasized. And so I quote from Kennan. He says, "Much depends on health and vigor of our own society. World communism is like malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. This is a point at which domestic and foreign policy meets. Every courageous and incisive measure to solve internal problems of our own society, to improve self-confidence, discipline, morale, and community of our own people is a diplomatic victory worth 1,000 diplomatic notes and joint communiques. If we cannot abandon fatalism and indifference in face of deficiencies of our own society," and he says Moscow, we could replace that with Beijing, or add in Beijing now that Russia political interference is also a great challenge, "will profit, and they cannot help profiting by them in their foreign policies." So as I identified, democracies have magic weapons, and now is the time to use all those magic weapons. And our governments can assess the damage, do their own assessments, and look at ways in which we can fix legislation or utilize legislation to increase funding to our agencies who could address the threat. And we need a public conversation about this issue, and many countries have followed this approach, including my own. The second resilience strategy that we need is to forge what I call the united front against the united front. And it's Leninist thinking, when it's not an ideological connection, it's identification of a common threat and some points in which countries can cooperate on. And what I've really emphasised has been looking to support each other economically, as so many countries have felt very vulnerable because of their economic dependence on China. And information sharing is very important too. What I showed in my research is that the CCP political interference activities have a recognisable pattern, and they're often cross-national too. So countries can strengthen their resilience by sharing information on what they're experiencing. And it's really important when we're looking at these issues that our leaders and commentators make a very clear distinction between China, the nation, the CCP, the Chinese population living in China, and the Chinese diaspora. Our Chinese communities need our support. And I know you've just had a terrible incident in the United States recently of a hate attack against your Asian community. So this is a very difficult issue to deal with, and we have to be extremely careful with our language. And we need to help to our Chinese communities to restore truly local and diverse Chinese language media and community groups. And where possible, we can support other states in developing better knowledge about the CCP and its policies. So that was my advice 4 years ago. How's it going? Well, in 2018, January 2018, the US issued its Indo-Pacific framework, and it's there to the right of me, and you'll see there's quite a bit of talk about China's political influence activities that was directly impacted by those two thunderbolts that came from Australia and New Zealand in September 2017. And soon after and crystallizing thinking that was already there, of course, and awareness in the US. And then the National Defence Strategy was issued soon after, and that also had a clear view of the challenges. And so the next goal that developed was a growing bipartisan consensus in Congress and then amongst the states, which was harder under your former president because of the great political divide that we can see, the world can see, and I know that you have all experienced. And it was hard to get the support of the allies also because of that, because of perceptions of your president. But nonetheless, there were joint agreements as countries could see the challenge, and it was just a matter of how to deal with it. So in September 2018, the Five Eyes signed a communique on working together on foreign interference. And a big economic agreement was signed. It was originally called TPPA, but the US government pulled out. So it was renamed CTPPA. And so it's been the developments in the Trump administration to address this issue, I think, were not as powerful as they could have been because of some diversions in approaches and perhaps a lack of emphasis on the allied response. But this is coming in very strongly now in the Biden administration with an emphasis on re-strengthening allied relations. And yesterday, an assessment was released by the Office of National Intelligence, talking about China's great fear of the Biden administration being able to organise a global alliance against China. Well, that's essentially what the United Front against the United Front would be. The Biden administration has reassured allies and partners by rejoining the Paris Agreement. We're seeing many more freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, not just from the US, but recently Germany, for example, which shows that allies share US concerns. And we're seeing efforts to coordinate allies on how to set up agreements on strategic technology, to access strategic minerals, and to coordinate their COVID response. So I would assess that we are now seeing that the United Front against the United Front is starting to come together, that many states are not just addressing political interference in their own countries, but they are coordinating and supporting each other and being more resilient. So that's all I wanted to talk about from my talk, and I welcome your questions. You're on mute, William.
Thank you very much, Professor Brady. Your work has been a real revelation to a lot of the world about some of the things that are going on. Let me start with a question about the priorities of United Front work. They do different things. They steal military secrets. They steal technology and other things for economic purposes and negotiation purposes. They sell their system as superior. One thing the Russians do is to deliberately try to disrupt democracies and make it difficult for democracies to function. We've seen that in the US election, the Russians tried to interfere directly on the side of Trump, and the Chinese decided not to interfere. What are their priorities? Do they share Russian interest in deliberately disrupting democracies?
Yeah, I think we can say that that would definitely be the case, that political interference in the case studies, China's political interference in the case studies that I've seen, that I've looked at across many countries, are having a negative impact on democracies. It is not democratic to have a foreign power trying to direct the policies of political parties, and especially covertly. It's having a corrupting and corroding effect on many societies. So it's undermining democracy, it's undermining trust in governments and trust in political parties. It's leading towards, it has a risk of leading towards alienation and cynicism towards governments. But we're also seeing that China is following some of the approaches of Russia to disinformation, just to destroy people's confidence in particular measures, for example, on COVID vaccines, to cast doubts on the vaccines that are being used widely around the world, that have come out of Europe, this Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca, and to highlight that only the Chinese vaccine is safe. So, I mean, that's a recent example of disinformation efforts underway. So yeah, China wants to work with governments, but ones that will work with China. But inherently, it prefers acquiescent governments, and that is not good for either for our sovereignty or for our democracies.
Thank you. When they try to discredit Western vaccines, is the purpose to market their own vaccine, or is it to undermine confidence in Western governments, or both?
Well, I think it'd be hard to without access to the party documents to assess which is more important. I'm sure there is a commercial interest, but it also leads. We're seeing in the Southwest Pacific the efforts to push Chinese vaccines and China access to Chinese PPE as a tool of foreign policy. So it can serve the agenda of binding countries closer to China and creating strategic dependencies on various countries and also we've seen that China's foreign ministry has announced in the last week that it will facilitate foreigners getting a visa who have the Chinese vaccine, have had the Chinese vaccine. Well, if you're in a place like New Zealand where our government has not approved the Chinese vaccine so far, that means that our business people and our New Zealand Chinese people who might have been going back to China or anybody else who's visiting China won't be able to go unless they have access to the Chinese vaccine. So that can also be used as a means to get elites to put pressure on their government about their relationship with China.
Thank you. We have some other questions. One is from Molly Silk, who's a third-year PhD student at the University of Manchester. She notes that in your original or famous article, you talk about using the United Front using culture as a soft power device or lever. How is that working out compared with the negative impact of China's authoritarian image?
Well, here's an example. Every year, people around the world celebrate the Lunar New Year. But since 2012, part of China's Tell a Good Story of China messaging has been promoting this as the Chinese New Year. But it's not just the Chinese New Year. People in Vietnam, for example, celebrate the Lunar New Year. And it's been very successful rebranding. Many countries have now taken on that terminology, not necessarily realizing the political aspects to it. And there are the Chinese embassies abroad are very, very involved in Chinese New Year celebrations. So in doing so, there is, for example, the community groups who are cooperating with the embassy, or who are, in fact, some of them are proxy organizations, United Front organizations who are prominent in those activities. And we've seen in the last couple of years displays on Xinjiang, as the CCP would like to see it, us to see it. And many of our politicians will go and attend those Chinese New Year events, thinking that in so doing they're honouring the diaspora community and their celebrations. So the challenge is for our governments to find a way to honour those cultural traditions, but to do so without the heavy hand of the Chinese embassy on the events and the connections and the emphasis on activities that are run by CCP United Front groups overseas. So I have been urging my government to seek out the Lunar New Year celebrations that are genuinely diaspora gatherings, and to minimise their participation in those that are organised by the embassy. And until recently, the majority of our Lunar New Year celebrations in my country were embassy connected and authorised in some way or another. The scale of it, the stuff is phenomenal, and there have been very little alternatives, and our politicians just blindly attended those events. So the cultural activities are still strong, depending on where you're looking.
Thank you. Bill Xiao, did you have a question?
Yes, I want to compliment you and Marie, your enlightened research and talk, and give us a different view, particularly about United Front. I would like to ask you a two-part question. In this geopolitical confrontation, because I will call your talk is a confrontation of two sides. What have the United States done around the world that or Russia have done previously in any kind of geopolitical struggle? Is China different than what the United States had done around the world? Interfering into other countries' politics, influence their elections? And then my subsidiary question, though, is, does China have the soft power to really persuade other nations to join them in the United Front? Yes, China may have economic power and also greater military power, but does China really have the soft power, as Joseph Nye has defined it? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Xiao. So your first question, with all due respect, is what's called whataboutism. So what that means is that we say somebody's doing something bad, so we can't criticize something else that's bad done by someone else. So I'm a specialist on Chinese politics, so I've focused in my research on what the CCP is doing, because that's what I've been trained to do and I'm employed to do. So I agree that the US has been involved in many, many activities that that are worthy of criticism and analysis, and there has been many aspects that we can see are parallel. And as I said in my research, China's United Front work was initially defensive. It was responding to what the US and its partners were doing. And I talked about peaceful evolution's concept for a start. But I don't think it's okay that we say, well, just because the US and other countries have engaged in this kind of behavior that we regard as unacceptable, that we can't look at what China's doing and address it and discuss it. You know, I'm really, really concerned about a narrative that's developed recently about the situation in Xinjiang with Uyghur and also Kazakhs who have been targeted by the CCP. That because of the ways, for example, of which countries treat their indigenous, other countries treat their indigenous people, that they can't speak up about Xinjiang. We should both address the problem of how our indigenous peoples have suffered and acknowledge that painful history and speak up for the human rights of the people in Xinjiang. We have to be able to hold complex ideas and recognize that there are things worthy of criticism in every country. So I think that it's wrong to just to distract from the topic of our conversation right now, which is China, by saying the US has just done the same thing. I think that we need to raise the concerns about the US, which are often very well known, but at the same time, we need to talk about this issue with China because it has been hidden, it's been deliberately hidden. And for the health of our societies, we need to address it and make ourselves more resilient. And my focus in my research, actually, I mean, I'm from a small state. We don't have the ability to get many countries to do what we want. But what we can do is make ourselves more resilient and strong. And so that's been my advice to my government and many other governments. So this, your second question about whether or not China has soft power that can get countries to join in its united framework. Well, you've got the concept a bit wrong there. First of all, Joseph Nye has been hugely critical of how Russia and China have misused the soft power terminology. Hu Jintao's government adopted the soft power term in 2007, and Nye says that the way that Russia and China use soft power is not what he means by soft power at all. The Russians have this concept of smart power, which they can say is a clever use of the useful bits of soft power and hard power combined, and they're doing that in their Antarctic policies, for example. So united front work is not something that you attract countries to. It's a secret CCP policy and strategy that is used as a tool of China's foreign policy, and sometimes is used in intelligence activities and also for military agendas. So there is a lot of covert activity involved in the United Front. So it's not about, again, it doesn't match the soft power, the ideas of what soft power is, that you naturally attract countries through the strength of your culture or your society. I mean, France is a great example of that. You know, many people are drawn to an interest in France because of their wonderful cuisine and language and literature and so on. So here is not a organic, natural drawing in of other countries. It's a deliberate targeting of elites in different countries to try and get around central governments. And here's an example: is Australia. The state of Victoria signed an agreement on the Belt and Road Initiative when the federal government of Australia was completely opposed to Belt and Road Initiative, and it's taken a long time for the Australian government to unravel that. So I would say that it's not the soft power concept, as Nye says, doesn't match the situation at all. But it does get put on as a label by China because their activities, because it's been useful to them. So thank you for your questions. I appreciate your perspective on, and I agree with you, your first point. I do agree with you, but I do believe that we can still talk about what China's doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question from an anonymous attendee who says there seems to be significant tension between core Western values like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and the types of measures that are needed to curb some of these influence operations. What can we say about how we balance these concerns? And this person specifically mentions that attempts to move toward reciprocity in treatment of international journalists may be self-defeating or self-harming, and are met with accusations of being anti-China.
Yeah, I don't really get the first part of the question, because I certainly haven't seen examples of how making our societies more resilient could be anti-democratic. I think that they are strengthening our democracy. So separately, the question of whether we should follow reciprocity with China, I mean, it's commonsensical, and that we should follow reciprocity. Why should we put our societies at a disadvantage with China? Why shouldn't we be expecting the same? We won't get what we want if we tolerate activities that are one-sided, that one side is being advantaged over the other. So the US approach to China was very shaped by ideological thinking about the peaceful evolution concept merging into the engagement thinking of Kissinger. And it was wrong-headed, believing that more we engage with China, we're going to change the CCP and bring about a democratic transformation. We have to drop that thinking and see China as it is today, and particularly China under Xi Jinping. And the CCP is defending itself and its political system, and we ought to also defend ourselves and our political systems.
There's another question from another anonymous attendee who would like to know how you see Chinese influence in the UN system and international NGOs. She says that having worked in a UN agency, she's seen how governments like the UK's try to steer UN agencies by funding, by appointments, and so on. Is there something particularly important or necessary to be concerned about in Chinese activities?
The expert on this topic is Andrea Warden, and she has published on this with Synopsis. So I recommend the person asking the question go and look at the website of Synopsis, which is a think tank based in Prague, who have published quite a lot of really good quality stuff on China's political interference activities. So they've had a couple of articles on both United Front work in the UN system and in other international organizations. So I think that you'll find some good information in there.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. There are a number of other questions, and maybe they'll follow up with you individually, but we're extremely grateful for your incisive remarks, and especially because you did it at 5:30 in the morning for us. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with you all, and I look forward to meeting in person in the near future. I'm sure it's going to be possible.
We hope so. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Ka kite. Bye.